to the United States, he had everything in his possession that he was to be elected as the Secretary of Treasury, and therefore he was instrumental in bringing in the first bank. But a little thing happened is they didn't allow the Rothschilds or the Bank of England to actually become the bank. It was other bankers who was German descent, Swedish descent, French, a whole bunch of different ones of the bank, but not the Bank of England itself.
So are you saying agents for the bank?
Yes, agents for the bank. And there wasn't enough agents for the Bank of England on the board that they could sway it so that they got in as the first bank. And that's why Hamilton cheated and embezzled the first bank with so much money that, that's why it went under. And then the second bank was reinstituted, and of course, that only lasted for a little while.
Right.
And then all the wildcat banks in the 1830s, it was just wildcat banks, and that's right. And they destroyed most of the states and Congress on their money, and that's why in 1841, when right before 1841, they instituted the independent treasury, which all the states and the United States put their money into. And that was a good bank because it dealt in specie only. It was no paper, no nothing like that. And then, of course, in 1841, the Whigs come into power, and they disbanded that. And then they were kicked out in 1845, and it was reinstituted as the independent sub-treasury, they called it. And that lasted all the way up until 1913, when Wilson and them bought in the Federal Reserve. Now, here's the Bank of England. See, they've been working. See, these people, they work and look 100 years down the road. They don't look like most Americans to the end of their nose, and that's as far as they can see. And so they were planning all along. They planned this all along, and finally got what they wanted, because actually the Federal Reserve banks, the Federal Reserve, actually issued Federal Reserve notes in the 1890s. People don't know this. Only people like us that are nuts and spend hours in the library researching mundane stuff find this stuff out. But they actually circulated Federal Reserve notes in 1892, 1893, 94, and then in the 1900s, that's when they had enough power that they came in and they were side by side with the independent treasury. And then in 1921, by the Act of 1920, it's not the year 1920, but by the Act of 1920, eliminated the sub-treasuries, instituted the Federal Reserve Bank as the fiscal agent of the United States government, and then all the people who were in the sub-independent treasuries and the Secretary of Treasury and everybody there, they became the General Accounting Office.
The GAO.
The GAO is. And they were all ex-Treasury people. So, and that's what happened. But that was instituted by Washington, and then Lincoln instituted the war powers and used it fully, and so did Roosevelt. And every president since then has been operating under the Emergency War Powers Act.
Well, I got to take you back.
In other words, they've never been disbanded.
Banded, right. Well, I got to take you back real quick, if you mind, and,
sure,
and you don't have to dwell on it, but I didn't hear the third central bank that supposedly Old Hickory killed.
You mean Jackson?
Yeah.
Yeah, when they wanted to redo their charter, that's when he knocked it out.
All right, so was there actually a third that finally reached its period of duration and wasn't renewed, or was a third never allowed?
No, the third was never allowed. The
Okay.
second was coming up for renewal, and this actually was the second bank on renewal, which would have been the third bank. Well, really, it's still the second, but this is why he killed it.
All right. Also, the Bank of England is a Rothschild bank. Would you call that the preeminent bank today of the world?
Yeah.
And it was back then for sure.
It was back, oh yeah, because that was in the city of London, which was separate. It wasn't anything to do with England itself. It was called the Bank of England, just like the first bank of the United States was a foreign controlled by all foreign people, but yet it was called the first bank of the United States. So everybody's saying, oh, well, it's the United States Bank. It's the first bank. No, it wasn't. It was the first bank in the United States, not of the United States.
Okay. So the United States quotes, and we're on the same page with this, that we quote, win the American Revolution. All I can see is that the King of England recognized the states.
Well, that's all he did. We didn't really win it. Not like a war that you would win, like we won the Second World War and the First World War. We didn't really win the First World War, but the second we did. And all the other wars after that has just been military skirmishes. They've been police actions. It's not a real war.
Right.
And there's one thing that most people don't realize. Under the War Powers Act, Congress does not have to have a declaration of war.
Right.
But did you know that any war to be eliminated, extinguished, has to be by treaty?
Well,
That's the only way a war, in other words, a treaty of peace is the only way. Now I'm going to read you verbatim out of a book that I just got called War Powers of the Executive of the United States. And all the way back on page 267 it says, in the fourth place, the President as Commander-in-Chief determines when and upon what conditions hostilities are to cease. Didn't say anything about Congress.
no.
And since, there's a semicolon, and since a treaty of peace is the only constitutional method provided for terminating a war on the part of the United States, comma, he may also, comma, by virtue of his treaty-making powers, very largely determine the definitive conditions of peace and the time for the final termination of the state of war.
Would that also mean that there really weren't any treaties that ended the Vietnam War, were they? Or
No, there
Gulf
were treaties.
So the President decides the hostilities are over, and that's it.
Yeah, that's it. And it said another thing that most people I've been seeing on the internet lately about the habeas corpus.
Mm-hmm.
Never was a right. It was always a privilege.
Yep.
Because the Constitution, remember, never gave anybody any rights. I would say any of your listeners, read the Constitution, pick out what rights are enumerated, and tell them to you.
Well, they would say to you the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights is not enumerated because it was only for the United States and it wasn't for anybody in the states of the Union. And the case of that, which I mentioned before, was John Barron versus the mayor and city of Baltimore, where the Supreme Court came out and said unequivocally, and it's never been overturned, that the Bill of Rights was not for the people nor the states. They were for those 207 inhabitants of Washington, D.C., and the garbage that are controlling it down there now.
All right, and that's where we once spoke about when they refer to the United States of America, they're referring to whom?
The corporation of the Crown called the United States. It's a subdivision of the British Crown.
And so those are also the ones you're talking about who are covered by the Bill of Rights?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. And because in here, in this book, under the War Powers of the Executive of the United States, under Powers of Police Control, on page 191, it says, in March 1863, Congress expressly authorized the President to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and legalize his past acts. But for 2 years, Lincoln had suspended the writ of his own accord and had made arrests without warrant, holding the suspects as long as he pleased, not only without express authority and contrary to the prevailing opinion of his power up to the time of the Civil War, but in direct opposition to the authoritative ruling of Chief Justice Taney. So they say they can do whatever they want. Bush can do whatever he wants. Congress has nothing to say about it.
Well, in courts, lower